This video is the second part in our series of explanations for some of the mechanisms of evolution. The first thing for us to talk about in this part are some factors that disrupt equilibrium. If you remember what we were talking about in the previous video, we were talking about the Hardy-Weinberg formula, and we said the idea of P plus Q equaling 1 symbolizes a population that's at equilibrium, meaning there's not a change in allele frequency, and everything is pretty much stable, that they're not going through any type of evolutionary change. The reason that we're talking about these factors here that disrupt equilibrium is because not everything stays that way. Some species experience changes that allow them, or changes in their environment that then allow them to physically change as well. So we have to talk about some factors that will disrupt that Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, some things that would cause that number to not add up to 1 at the end. The first one to talk about is referred to as gene flow. This is simply explained as migrations in and out of a population. Oftentimes we think of migrations as birds and things like that migrate long distances for a certain time of year. In this case, really what we're talking about are just new individuals entering or leaving a population. This actually isn't that uncommon, especially when it comes to species that have a lot of competition between males. Like say there's a species with an alpha male like a wolf. When a young wolf is born, like a wolf pup, and they grow up, if it's a male wolf, then they will generally end up leaving that pack, and they might go in and start their own pack somewhere else. So that would be a simple example of gene flow, as that wolf leaves one area and moves on to another to start its own group, because there can only be one alpha. So there are sometimes other males in the group, but if that male is going to start its own group somewhere else, that would just be a simple example of gene flow, of it leaving and going to another area. Another one to talk about that we've discussed in previous chapters is the idea of mutations. We've talked about the concept that mutations happen randomly. It's going to be in any change in the genetic information of that population, and ultimately it's not something that can be prevented. Something to remember is we talked about 3 different kinds of mutations. It can either be helpful, benign, or negative. Mostly what we're looking at here are the helpful mutations that would benefit the population and therefore be something that actually stays as one of their phenotypes. The last one then is referred to as non-random mating. We'll get into this more as an example as we work our way through the video, but there are some species that are influenced by certain factors when it comes to mating. A simple way of looking at this is something we call sexual selection. So in this case, the bigger males are favored, and they usually compete then over the right to reproduce with the females. Another example of this is males that are brightly colored. So you think of things like fish and birds, where the male is actually usually the brightly colored individual, and then the females have more sort of benign colors. So that's an example of non-random mating, where some of those traits are selected for in the population because the males that have them are the males that get to reproduce and pass on their genes. The next thing for us to talk about, since we're discussing some different mechanisms of evolution, are different ways that natural selection can take place. This is the last thing that can throw off that Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, is if there are different kinds of natural selection. So remember, Charles Darwin gave us this term. What we're going to talk about here are just a couple different kinds. The first one is referred to as stabilizing selection. We'll look at this graph, which is from your textbook, to help this make sense. Just so you understand what we're looking at here, this dashed line represents the original population. The new graph on here that's filled in with the light green, that represents our new population. So here you can see it says the original is the dashed line, and then the population after selection is the new one. So our population used to be pretty broad. These are considered the 2 extremes. So for example, if we're looking at birth weight in human babies for this one, this would be a really, really big baby that's maybe a little bit too heavy. This one would be one that's too light. So in the middle, we'd have the babies of an ideal birth weight. So that's actually something that is subject to stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection is going to favor the average trait, and the extremes are going to be things that are not favorable. That's why it's low on the graph. So for human babies, the baby being too big is a bad thing for its survival. The baby being too small, though, is a bad thing for its survival. So if it's in the middle, if it has average birth weight, that's a good thing. So that ends up pushing up the middle portion of this graph. More individuals have that sort of average trait because the extremes in this case are a bad thing. So stabilizing selection, if you're looking for a simple definition to write down, is a selection that favors the average trait. Directional selection is a little bit more complex than what we're seeing with stabilizing selection. Directional selection is going to favor one extreme trait. So we have the same kind of graph back again, but again we're looking at the original population, but now instead of being skewed towards the middle, skewed towards the average, you can see that it's skewed towards the right. It's moved towards one of the extremes. So this used to be an extreme part of the population. Now it's becoming more of the average of our new population, which means one of these extreme traits were favorable. So that's our simple definition for this, for directional selection, is that an extreme trait is favored. I'll give you two simple examples of this one. The first one are actually Darwin's finches. If you think about it, in the beginning, all of these finches had like medium-sized beaks. There's two kinds of directional selection that takes place. One that favors the really big, thick beaks for the birds that had to crack open nuts and things like that on the islands where they were living. The other form of directional selection actually favors the small, slender beak for the birds that are eating insects on the islands where they're living. So the one in the middle, like the average beak, is actually selected against in favor for the really big and the really small beaks, depending on which island those birds are living. Another example, if you remember back in the survival game, one of the things that could happen to your species is the predator would come along. When the predator comes along, it's very helpful for your species to have long legs, so that way they can run away from the predator. If you look, when I took this screenshot, I had already had the predator for a few thousand years, maybe like 10 or 20,000 years, and you can see he's already picked off all of the slow, short-legged individuals in my population. So this favors a form of directional selection, where you end up with all of your individuals having those long legs so they can deal with the predation that's taking place in their population. The last one of the different types of selection for us to talk about, at least that deal with the graph on here, is disruptive selection. So you hopefully saw this one coming based on the other two that we talked about. If we again have our original population, and in this case, for disruptive selection, it favors the extreme traits. So you can see this used to be an extreme. It now favors that because our population is higher over that part of the graph. But the interesting thing here is that it selects against the average trait that we're seeing in the population. So in this case, both of the extremes are good, but the average trait ends up being bad. An example for this one are the northern water snakes. Some of these snakes live in areas where their coloration, if it's darker, it allows them to blend in with their environment. Others live in an area with like less moss and less plants, and their coloration allows them to blend into the rocky environment. So these are actually the same original species. They've just adapted different colors based on the environment that they live in. The interesting thing is the original species used to be kind of a blending of both of these. It used to be one that wouldn't fit in this environment, and it wouldn't fit in that environment either. So the two extremes, like the darker coloration, allows this particular type of the northern water snake to blend in well with its sort of like moss-covered and more heavily like planted environment, whereas this one lives more on these barren rocks. You can see it's almost like a marble type coloration, and then its body plan then blends in with that color as well. So disruptive selection, again, is going to favor the extreme traits, and it selects against the average trait. The final one for us to talk about is something that I alluded to at the beginning of the video. This one is referred to as sexual selection. This is actually what most people probably think of when we talked about survival of the fittest back at the beginning of the chapter. You know, the idea that the biggest, strongest individuals are the ones that survive and pass on their genes, and sometimes that's true. So what sexual selection is doing is in this case only certain males sort of qualify for the right to reproduce with the females in the population. So we'll go through a couple of examples of this, all of which show things a little bit differently. Walruses, which are gigantic creatures, the males will compete over the right to breed with females. So you can see these two males are fighting, so it's to their advantage to be quite large. The bigger the walrus is, the more likely it is, to maybe push the smaller one around, and then that's the one that passes on its traits by reproducing with the females. So in this case, you can see how over time the walruses get very big because it's favorable for their reproduction, for their genetic fitness to be able to pass on their traits. So the larger they are, the more it favors that part of their fitness. Another example of this is the moose. Moose have these giant antlers to the point where they're impractical. I mean, they get caught in trees and shrubs and things like that all the time. And the moose, the reason they have these giant antlers is to help attract the female moose, and also to help them compete with other moose. So they sort of like fight and clash together in order to protect like the area where they're trying to reproduce with the females. So in this case, these giant antlers are going to be part of the factors that contribute to the sexual selection for the moose. The last one is the peacock. Classic example here for sexual selection. The males have these ridiculous feathers. If you're not aware of that, this is actually the male peacock. The female peacock has much more muted colors. It's more of like a brown. And in this case, we're seeing this lavish plumage of feathers which the males use to attract the females. They also do like a little dance that kind of goes along with this to try to attract them. And something to consider is some of these traits get so extreme that it's actually bad for the male's survivorship overall. Like, it's much easier for a predator to catch this peacock than one with much smaller feathers. Yet, because of sexual selection, because this is the one that's chosen by the females to reproduce and pass on its genes, this is a trait that's selected for in the population. So it's kind of interesting because we talked about fitness in two ways. We said the individual has to be well adapted to its environment to survive, and then it also has to pass on its genes. In this case, sexual selection gets a little weird because these guys are passing on more of their genes, but they might not actually be better adapted to survive in the environment. So it starts to muddy that line a little bit, but overall this is definitely something that we still see as a big factor for natural selection. So keep in mind, all the things that we talked about in this video are things that can throw off that Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. They can change that formula and get it to equal something other than 1, meaning that there is some type of change happening in the population that could lead to evolution taking place. So thank you very much for taking the time to watch. Make sure you answer the questions at the end of the video.